Welcome back to Radio Rothbard. I'm Ryan McMaken, executive editor at the Mises Institute. And today we're going to do a topic that mostly I've been just trying to forget about, but which we must not allow ourselves to forget about, and that is the COVID lockdowns and just the general overall COVID panic. And my guest today to talk about that is Tho Bishop. And part of the reason for that is Tho and I were both working here at the Mises Institute during that period. And so we had a certain common experience as far as COVID was concerned professionally. But at the same time, he was living in Florida at the time, which was a little bit different. But I think we're going to look at a little bit of that just on the personal level, but also just looking at the overall narrative that occurred during COVID. And then I think maybe we'll just wrap up with maybe some speculation about how did we learn anything from COVID, or are we ripe for just something similar to happen again, lockdowns related to, I don't know, the environment, to some sort of foreign policy alleged threat. Who knows? But I think we can. It bears some talking about, because I just feel like the fact that it just was swept under the rug, and there's only seems to be a small minority of people who are interested in really trying to prevent it from happening again. People just seem happy that it's over, and no need to really punish the people involved. I mean, certainly there are those people who are pushing for that, but I don't think those people are really in the mainstream, or that there's any real concern with it. But Tho might have another point of view on that. So I thought we would just kind of begin by just reminding some people about what the overall narrative was at the time, because here we are in March 2025, and you may recall that things started to go very, very badly in March of 2020. And this is burned into my mind in many ways, and the sort of stuff that we started to see on social media. And I want to get kind of your early reaction, though. Uh, but I remember, right? You started to see on social media. You and I were already haunting Twitter back then, right? And you started to get all this stuff. It was like these propaganda videos coming out of China of like people collapsing on the street and all of that sort of stuff. And you didn't know what to make of it. You had, like, no, sort of context for, what is the takeaway here? And then they start talking about lockdowns and how you're gonna need, like, some sort of, like, disease passport. They hadn't quite gotten to the vaccine point yet, but they were prepping you for that. And we might have to lock down, whatever that meant, or the stay-at-home order was the official thing. And I thought, okay, we'll probably get some of that, but there's no way they'll be able to push it like what to the point of what they're talking about. And then they did. And so by late March, it was just astounding what we were looking at, what we were talking about. It was such like a sneak attack was how I would describe it, right? Is that kind of like the Patriot Act, right? It was like something they had written years ahead of time, and they were preparing to just slip in as soon as they had the opportunity. And that just seemed like they've been talking about the whole lockdown thing for years. Some people apparently have, and they were just looking for the right time to do it. So just the swiftness and the completeness with which it happened, and the weakness of the opposition, was all very shocking. And it was you were being prepped for it with all these strange online videos. And a lot of my reaction to it was simply surprise. And I think a lot of people were surprised. But I'd be interested to just get a take on kind of what your early reactions were as well.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I remember for like, a decade plus, we've been hearing from Alex Jones about like FEMA camps. And I was like, oh, this is obviously outrageous. And then, oh, maybe another quarter in the Alex Jones's right jar right there. But something else I think is interesting was just the profound shift in who was concerned about COVID, which happened remarkably fast. Because I remember in January of 2020, right, where you go on Zero Hedge, and you'd go on sort of, alt, the sort of circles that typically have some overlap with Mises Institute content. And at the time, the warning sign was, hey, there's something big brewing in China. I remember like, oh well, the emissions about coming out of China shows that they're burning bodies at a faster rate than than they're saying, or the mortality rate is over there. And so it was like an alt-right media sort of story there, like Tucker Carlson going to Mar-a-Lago and telling Trump that he's not taking this seriously enough. And then you fast forward a few weeks, and then boom, it becomes the regime narrative. And I think it's fitting that the day that really changed everything in the United States on COVID was March 11th. And the only common cultural experience we have in America today is sports. And I don't want to overstate the universality of the appeal to the NBA, but that was the NBA game that got canceled because of COVID. And that was the moment where I felt like it truly went mainstream, because once you started canceling professional sports leagues, right, that was what it took to kind of really push it full blast. And then shortly thereafter is when you start having from DC, the national lockdowns. You have states following largely aligned behind that, with one exception early on, right, being South Dakota. North Dakota, whichever, I can't remember which of the, I always get this Dakota.
South was a real
South
latecomer, yeah.
Yeah, and that whole thing, right, I know the governor there got a lot of credit for it, but it was actually the legislature kind of stopped her from continuing through there. But those are some of the early takeaways I had. Was one, again, this massive shift from it becoming something that was big within regime skeptic circles to becoming the preferred narrative of the regime. That one moment that made it mainstream with sports, and then just how quickly things ramped up from there. I remember I was going door to door in a mayor's race at the time, like while they were seeing the press conference there, like all of a sudden like people wouldn't open their door, right, because they were so terrified of strangers, and understandably so, like the fear, whatever. I mean, it was understandable given how little we knew at the time. But like that, those are some of my early memories. There was, for one, being out in the community, kind of seeing how quickly the social dynamic changed, and some of those different factors. Because early on, I was reading a bunch of Zero Hedge. I was concerned about it, and then I saw the regime embrace, like, maybe need to pump brakes a little bit on this.
Yes, it was just remarkable. It was a thing that you and me being in our line of work, it was like watching an experiment unfold in real time, some sort of creepy government experiment as to how far they could push it. And now I guess I need to back up a little bit on my idea that they'll never be able to get the full extent of what they wanted, because they didn't actually, in the end, get the full extent of what they wanted. And let's look at that a little bit, right? Because now you'll remember at the very beginning, it was the 2 weeks to slow the spread thing. And through social media and through regular media, given all sorts of, and remember, social media was increasingly censored as time went on during this period. So you couldn't, well, at the beginning they hadn't gotten their act together in terms of their evilness. You could still say some things, but as time went on, they started creating this clear party line that you weren't allowed to contradict without having your account suspended and that sort of thing. And so early on, it was the 2 weeks to slow the spread thing, and the graphs showed you how, yes, the idea is you slow the spread so that hospitals don't get overwhelmed. Um, a- and of course, then we got videos purportedly telling us how their bodies were piling up everywhere and the hospitals were overwhelmed. These, interestingly, were contradicted by, of course, the infamous nurse and doctor dancing videos, which were apparently doctors and nurses were so overwhelmed that they had hours and hours to choreograph dances and practice, and then put together videos of them at work in empty hospitals. So the whole thing was very bizarre and surreal. But the idea was then, okay, you got to slow the spread. That's only going to take 2 weeks. But then that quickly morphed into the zero COVID strategy. And this was the idea that we can't let anybody out of their homes until we get a vaccine. And well, there was actually two stated purposes here. One was, if we just totally lock down, then the disease will be unable to spread and it will just go away quickly. And then at the same time, they're saying, okay, so we need to test everybody, but of course these tests were like hypersensitive, so tons of people were showing up as having COVID,
Yeah.
even though they were totally asymptomatic.
Yeah, a great year for the flu. Went away.
Right. Yeah, the flu disappeared because everybody with flu-like symptoms was coming in as a COVID patient. And so, oh, and then during the whole slow the spread thing, remember the endless articles about, do we have enough ventilators in hospital XYZ, right? It all had all the classic characteristics of a psyop, right? They would say, okay, this is something that we're concerned about now. We're concerned about ventilators now, and then you were just overwhelmed with endless stories about ventilators everywhere. But then that morphed into the zero COVID thing where if we lock down hard enough, and these were the phrases they were using. If we lock down hard enough, then the disease will just stop spreading to anybody and then it'll go away. And then a variation of that was, we just simply cannot lift any stay-at-home orders until we have a vaccine, and then everybody gets vaccinated, and then you're allowed to leave the house. And when is this vaccine going to be here? We're not sure yet, but eventually. So maybe like a year from now, we can let you out of your house. And they were literally saying things like this. You had like Rahm Emanuel in Chicago saying, well, we might get to the point where we can finally let people leave their homes once we have a vaccine. We had um, Fauci, I suddenly can't remember Fauci's name. We had Fauci saying that, and this is almost like a direct quote. Well, as we monitor cases, if we see cases go down enough, then maybe we can slightly lighten up on stay at home orders and people will be able to leave their homes for a time. They were saying things like this. So they were in it for the long haul, like 24 months, not be no end to the stay at home order. So that was really kind of the goal. That was what the assumption they were working on. And fortunately, that started to unravel after a little while, but only due, I think, to the grumpy opposition from people who we were then calling conspiracy theorists and crazy people, who all turned out to be right.
Well, and I think some of the things that predated, we've had some great talks. A couple of years ago, we had a wonderful talk, an event up in New Hampshire featuring Dr. Peter McCullough and other speakers there that laid out all of the basically the blueprints, kind of military style, like just give us a couple time and we'll be able to put in this plan to invade Iraq, right? Style thinking of this background militarization of the public health industrial complex, essentially. And part of it was, yes, it starts with, I think Bush's interest in, he read a book on the Spanish flu. So that's Bush's biggest problem. It's not that he didn't read, he read too much, neither here nor there. So that was kind of the start of elements there, and then Obama with Ebola. Again, like this entire militarization of a public health apparatus designed to, and of course all the funds involved, the incentives aligned with that sort of stuff. We can talk about gain-of-function research and Fauci's role in that, right? So there was all these blueprints already in place, just ready for a crisis. And they got one. So I think that aspect of the buildup, that aspect of the story, is something that was, again, think about how much anti-regime, spooky sort of stuff we read about the state. I wasn't familiar with any of this sort of stuff, a little bit here and there, right? But typically those sort of conversations were even in, we're again, like you get on Alex Jones' show rather than traditional sort of anti-regime intellectual sort of circles there, which again is fascinating. And then the second component, though, and this was the silver lining of the story, is that this is one of the rare examples, though they're not unheard of, gun rights fits to this category as well, but of American federalism in particular actually working for a change. And it was only that tension, and of course, because each state has their own special interest groups, right? So Florida, for example, which trailed Georgia, I will give credit to Georgians there, but in Florida, for example, though, the special industry lobby that is tourism, lockdown's very unpopular, as one could expect. And so it was precisely the specific economic dynamics within the states that allowed for enough friction there to start getting true breakaways from state-level action. And there was a secondary component to this as well, which is kind of the decadence of the modern economy. And I'm not using that in a critique necessarily, because I appreciate my various I'm glad that I can order groceries from Walmart. It helps my wife a great deal. But I think there's this a modernity, utopianism sort of style component to it, where like if you ignore the actual need to produce real things, right, the entire ecosystem where the ability to live without going downtown or visiting your main street, area in your community has been largely eroded because of technical innovation. And so there was an ability to kind of sell this story about, oh, well, we can largely continue things going on. There's always this sort of class dynamic, right? So that's where you immediately had, that creation of essential workers and non-essential workers, right? And so the essential workers, by the logic of the policymakers, were expendable because we needed them to toil away at stuff. The people that were in the unessential market that was having their livelihoods impacted in their own way, right? So there was this government-created class dynamic there, which neither side was particularly happy with at the time. So I think that a number of these factors, and again, the silver lining of that American federalist system, which a lot of nations, a lot of other countries did not enjoy the benefit of, are all, again, I think very interesting meta-narratives on top of the specifics of this, easy to say policy blunder, but really this great human tragedy. I mean, one of the greatest, the most horrific experiments the state has ever put upon civilization.
Yeah, and I think that's the second lesson to be learned here. The first was that they were just going to change the narrative to suit whatever kind of their whims were at any given time.
I mean, literally changing the definition of what a vaccine is. I mean, like changing the most profound. Again, Fauci, again, knowing that 6 feet apart in your grocery store doesn't do anything, right? I mean, the fact that they deliberately knew. I mean, this isn't some. We can have a conversation about vaccines, right, and about the efficacy of vaccines, right? I'm willing to grant some element of kind of a cloud of war dynamic, but when you have people specifically disavowing common, well-known science, right, all happening in real time.
Oh yeah, narrative, right, the definitions of things. You would get on the internet one day and look up a definition of thing, and then it was a different thing a couple of days later. Really shocking, and then, yeah, how they defined the lockdown. And they, by the way, claim that there weren't lockdowns now. Because, I mean, Fauci was getting on and in 2023 was saying, well, we never had lockdowns. And Rand Paul's like, what are you talking about? He's like, well, it wasn't like China lockdowns. True, people were not having their front doors welded shut so they could not leave their houses. And I guess if that's your definition now of a lockdown, then yeah, okay. So they just changed words as we went along, and that's a lesson learned. The second lesson was what you just brought up, right? Was that it turns out, and this was a good lesson to learn, it turns out it matters what state you live in some circumstances, and this was certainly a big one, right? Because we've heard for years that people threatening, I'm going to move to state X because the state Y that I live in, the taxes are too high. And that just never seemed to happen that much. But then during COVID, it seemed to really happen. And people figured out that, who my governor is, who controls my legislature, that actually matters a lot. And I actually lived in a somewhat moderate state. Colorado has a reputation as being kind of like junior California, but it wasn't, fortunately, nearly that bad. And Jared Polis is a relatively sane human. I mean, scumbag politician, but at least a relatively sane person. And also doesn't have the same interest groups that you have in California. So it wasn't like that, but at the same time, though, when you compare it to a state like Georgia or Florida, clearly it makes a big difference where you're living.
Absolutely. I remember vividly, you had an article in early February before COVID was the story about why open borders between states in America might lead to disaster. The entire point was that the fact that you have open borders actually helps facilitate kind of national control over, over people, going from state to state, which was used as a justification, right? Like that was a big talking point about the need for these national lockdowns because you'd have these super spreaders in Florida coming to invade New York and whatever. So that itself was used to help justify some of these sort of things. I remember you getting mocked by certain libertarians out there, but man, give it a month, and that was quite an interesting.
Right, because if you don't have a single uniform nationwide policy, then one state can ruin everything by not locking down.
Yeah, but again, that's why COVID is so interesting to me, because talking to Mises U students, for example, yesterday I was talking to a homeschooling high school student who's a member of a Mises student program this year, and she gave a story that I've heard a lot through Mises U. You go to Mises U and you ask them, well, how did you discover the Mises Institute? And for the longest time, it was usually Ron Paul for quite some time, and then it was like, oh, well, I saw a libertarian meme or something like that, or I listened to Dave Smith, and then increasingly with younger students, it was because of COVID. COVID happened. It was horrible for their family. Their family started reading more deeply into libertarian literature. Their kid suffered through it. They're now interested in our ideas, right? But like for me, I really don't have a lot of trauma for COVID because I can remember like the 1 month of not doing much. I mean, it didn't stop me from socializing with my friends. It was never that strict in my particular area within Florida itself. That's why the Panhandle is the best part of Florida. But literally June of 2020, I went to a local MMA fight. Went to a dive bar afterwards that was shoulder to shoulder with music playing indoors, and that was June of 2020. And so for us, like the Florida's very very quick response out of it. It was a little bit different for blue states or for blue cities, which goes to that local control aspect of it too. It wasn't until later than that where Florida was much more heavy-handed in restricting local control there. But so my experience is very different. I mean, I talked to friends from Canada, I talked to friends from New York, I talked to friends from California, I talked to friends from the areas that were the most affected. And I mean, this is a lasting, traumatic scar. And of course, we're still seeing it play out. At AERC last week, there was a conversation about the students coming into college classes now and about how far they are behind the whole educational dynamic. Now, that's obviously not an endorsement of going to government schools, right? But again, that's the generational trauma that really separated. And because I think one of the unique aspects to this, right, and I think this is a positive from our point of view, right, but you think of national tragedies in the past. You think about 9/11, for example, right? You had a national response. You had a national shared experience. Now, if you're in New York, right, if you saw the Twin Towers from your window and they're no longer there, you're going to have a different emotional pull than somewhere else. But everything there was, everyone was waving up the American flags, right? You had a national response. Here, you had such a bipolar response. And that came one of two ways, right? If you were in New York early on where things got really bad, right, there were definite hotbeds early on where I'm sure the fear index was here. And if you were in an area that wasn't a hot spot, your fear index was here. And so you had a asymmetry there early on just in terms of what COVID meant to you and the fear dynamic aspect of that. But then also the policy response to it, where half the country had one very different experience, and then the government tyrannical aspect was very different from others. And I think that has further broken away a lot of the way that you're naturally going to perceive state policies, faith in institutions, et cetera, et cetera. Because on one side, a softer approach was vindicated. The other side of it, you have scars, or still to this day, kind of a deification of it. I mean, there's certainly an ideological aspect in how you perceive these sort of things, but you did not have a national response to COVID. You had very different situations for this issue that captured the country. And I think the lasting consequences of that in terms of the way we perceive the state and narratives and things like that is something that is very difficult to get the genie back in the bottle, which from our perspective, that wants no one to trust anything that ever comes out of DC. I think that is one of the big silver linings of what, again, is a unmistakable tragedy.
Yeah, and young people got it just the worst of all. When I meet kind of people of a certain age, I ask them, right, how bad did COVID screw you in terms of, right, were you in college? Were you like a freshman in college when in 2020, which meant basically your college time was erased in terms of being able to leave home if you were in one of those states. Maybe you were a teenager and you were forbidden to now go socialize with other people. Now, of course, even in my state, which had some stay-at-home orders and stuff, right? Most of the people in my social circles didn't really care. And certainly our religious organizations went on. And so it didn't impact them as much, but they were still surrounded by the chaos and fear that they were fed every day through media of some type from outside the state, if not from other people in the community who were paranoid and crazy about it. And so that impacts people, and I think it impacted the young people just the absolute worst. So, yeah, I continue to this day to cut those people some slack if they got the worst of the COVID experience because they were younger. And just imagine if you were a young worker, right? Now you have no work mentors, you have no one on which to base your work experience because now you're just going to stay at home and you never see your supervisor in person, who might be someone that you might have learned something from, and just really terrible. And you're certainly not going to be meeting anyone out in the open who might be a marriageable partner or anything like that. And probably we can attribute some of this just to bizarre decline in interest among people in terms of pairing off or even having sex with another live human being. This seems to be just of secondary importance now to 20 somethings, which is unimaginable and would have been unimaginable when I was in my 20s, that people were so indifferent to the idea. And so I think we can blame a lot of that on COVID. And back to your point then, the way that affected one group of people in one place is they're going to be feel very differently about it in another place, and their experience would have been very, very different. And so I think we're going to continue to maybe just see some of those memories continue and affect the political sphere for a while.
Absolutely, and I think we're going to talk a little bit about the extent to which the medical profession became essentially political, and that's one of the lasting impacts, as well as the perception that average people have of their doctor, of medical institutions, institutions generally. There's a number of factors, right? We're definitely living in this populist age, and it's interesting. I focus on, I deal a lot with local local politics, and just seeing the way that average people treat almost any large institution. Sometimes I would argue incorrectly, is that there's just this inherent distrust of anything big, and a lot of that all stems from the extent to which we were lied to by the people that you were told knew what they were doing, right? And there's no better example of that than the medical profession, the extent to which it's become cartelized, the extent to which the credentialing aspect of it was enforcing a specific line, the outright assault on the free speech rights, of which free speech is kind of just the common term, right? But the ability for doctors to do their job, right? The extent to which, and of course, there's a number of these things that all played out in the same area, right? You had COVID, you had the Summer of Love and George Floyd protest, and the immediate hypocrisy of, okay, you have to be locked down, but it's okay to protest because racism is a bigger public threat, right? There's the obvious absurdity of that in general, but also the extent to which, you had this basically nationwide narrative where you had Republican and Democrats on the same exact, basically preaching from the same choir, the same book on the specifics of that incident, which tied into this larger cartel of thought, of acceptable thought on COVID. You had the Trump election on January 6th and election integrity issues in January of the following year. You had all these punch, and just exposing what Rothbard and what Rothbardians always knew, right, is the extent to which you have a very controlled element of acceptable thought, the way that these higher, largely government-aligned institutions promote narratives to get the public to do what they want, but just how visible it was, and the lasting impacts. Again, no profession has suffered more than the medical profession in particular, because kind of in the same way that, essentially banking regulation has made banks a proxy of the state. And for people focusing on Fed stuff, we've seen this for quite some time, right? Know your lender laws. It turns out not to be a very good thing. In this way, it's kind of don't know your patient laws, essentially, which is what COVID, a medical practice became, right? We saw it play out with the medical sphere, the extent to which your traditional medical practitioner is going to be an uncritical elevator of whatever the narrative is in terms of medical treatment. Like the lasting impacts there are something we're still dealing with, and that's a dangerous thing too, because medicine's a good thing. Like healthcare is a good thing. You need to know who you can trust in this sort of stuff, and for me, like particularly as someone who has got 2 kids under 2, trying to figure out things like, what is a proper vaccine schedule for a newborn, right? Like I know that I should probably not be giving Hep B vaccines to a 1 hour long kid. But does that mean that every vaccine is therefore bad? I don't know the answer to that. I still don't have a great answer to that question, and I don't know who to trust anymore because of just how much the medical profession showed what they're doing. And again, you're talking about the fact there have been no arrests and the extent to which the prescribed medicine, again, ignoring the vaccine question, ignoring some of these others, the extent to which it was the prescribed medicine of ventilators and the treatments that we now have a pretty good idea, like it's kind of broadly accepted, even outside of our aligned, sort of Great Barrington Declaration sort of medical practitioners, the extent that so amplified the mortality rate here. I mean, it's absolutely awful. And again, you need a functioning society needs a trusted medical establishment, and they burnt it all down in a way that it's going to take generations to recover.
Yeah, well, and that's the third lesson here, right? Is that the whole medical profession is in many ways an arm of the state, like the bankers, like you say, because we saw that and we saw their complicity in declaring whatever the state wants to regulate as a medical emergency or a public health crisis, right? And I will never forget, it was during the stay-at-home order here where there was a protest out on the Capitol steps, and I went to that just to observe and see what was going on, and of course, just be in a crowd of people. And the next day, I remember the local news hauled in some young nurse, who I now kind of feel sorry for. I feel like she was exploited by the local news station. They're like, "How do you feel about these people coming within 6 feet of other human beings?" And she said, "It feels like a slap in the face." This nurse was basically saying, "Don't protest. It's a slap in the face of us people on the front lines," right? Of course, the front lines in the medical profession, I guess, means doing choreographed dances, because that's what they were doing a lot. And that was just another aspect of how they were absolutely trashing their reputation. But uh, enthusiastically declared COVID to be a public health crisis, but then turned on a dime within minutes when asked to declare racism a public health crisis, and that therefore everyone's allowed to protest in groups of thousands of people because of George Floyd. I mean, just right then, any person with a critical thinking would lose all respect for any doctor or nurse who went along with that. And then, of course, you started to see people really start to dig deep, and I was among the people, but just one, who dug up just a few years ago when Johns Hopkins did a now famous study showing that medical errors are the number 3 cause of death in America. And this is, of course, a highly controversial study. But they said doctors and nurses or not even just doctors and nurses, but medical personnel in general, kill 250,000 Americans a year because they're just so lazy and negligent. And I actually looked at a lot of the data on that, and I even lowballed it. I'm like, okay, let's take the lowball number here from a variety of studies. Let's say just 100,000 people a year. And so people started looking at that and really just started seeing how this profession, which holds itself up as basically the whole at the level of thank you for your service, right? With like service people, you see someone in scrubs, you should be thanking them for their service because they're some sort of superhuman. That whole thing just started to break down immediately, and well deserved. If that was the sort of thing you were willing to go along with. The problem is, of course, now how do you tell? How do you tell if your nurse that's helping you out was one of those people that is essentially an arm of the regime, or if there's someone who came along and never went along with that and never agreed to that? Of course, part of that is a lot of the people who disagreed with that were fired and driven out of the profession. So a lot of the people left among the doctors and nurses are people who never resisted at all. So that's kind of an unfortunate commentary on who's currently in the profession. But yeah, that was just brutal for what happened. That was a hard lesson to learn.
Well, that's why like the go-to question, but if you're having a medical practitioner for the first time, is what were your views on COVID? And if you're double vaxxed, I'm not interested in taking your opinion seriously. I'll give a little bit of fog of war for like the if you're vaxxed once, okay, I'm gonna keep that in the back of my mind, but that's not necessarily disqualifying. But that's also why, like, again, I think in the state response aspect of it, like one of the best moves that DeSantis made was bringing in Joseph Ladapo as a Surgeon General, because here was someone who had medical expertise, someone who was before he was fairly well respected, and who was out there from day one, like when they had the frontline medical practitioners out protesting COVID, like right from day one, and the fact that like he pulled someone of that unique specialties into that position is I think important. And it also made me think just how important, right? I guarantee you more people are following, who is NIH director now than ever before, like with a new administration, who is the CDC head and things like that, recognizing just how much power, because again, since medical practitioners are this extension of the state, who you have in these agencies that we generally don't want to think about or usually may not have been that aware of matters a great deal because everything's going to come down the stream from that.
Well, and of course, the whole issue of vaccination, right, continues to dog us. You could look at a bit of the narrative on that was, and this relates just back to the whole issue of lockdowns, and of course, the general lockdown morphed into the whole you're locked down if you're unvaccinated, and you had crazy people like Lena Wen on CNN saying things like, "You shouldn't even be allowed to leave your house. You shouldn't be allowed to have a normal life. We need to make life hard for people who are unvaccinated." Just real totalitarian stuff that people were saying, and we brought on Gilbert Burdeen, who's had some columns here. He's a Texas Tech professor of medicine, and we had him here on Radio Rothbard talking about just because he's not an anti-vaxxer by any stretch of the imagination. He thinks many vaccines are wonderful, probably thinks most. But he was noting things like there was no if you did a cost benefit analysis of getting vaccinated as a young person, it was clearly against. There was clearly no benefit from getting vaccinated as a young person due to the risks and the possible benefits. He said if you were over 60, sure, I could see some clear benefit to getting vaccinated given the risk profile of the disease and everything. He says, but just the way they pushed it on everybody, just shocking, and I think just showed the lack of rigor and lack of critical thinking among medical personnel.
And I think this goes to a larger approach. And there's, I think, a larger policy component that is important to recognize that I don't think it's brought up enough within the context of this conversation. Though we've had some doctors in the past present papers on it, which is the extent to which the gradual codification of medical treatment, which was always in place, as soon as you started having government intervention within the insurance market, right, you have to find a way of properly billing that, and then Obamacare boosted up to a whole new level, right? So the entire goal is that essentially through public policy and the financing of medical care, you've had to grossly simplify medical treatment to make it easier to bill. And that creates this larger dynamic of kind of one-size-fits-all prescription policies on broad topics. Now, obviously, you come in for a certain thing, right? Okay, maybe you get this, are you allergic to this medicine, then try that medicine, right? So like there's still, obviously they treat symptoms that are individualized when they present itself. But like this goes to this broader conversation about vaccines, is this one-size-fits-all vaccine schedule generally, which with COVID, we saw it just amplified with the novelty and the unique circumstances of it, that, everyone has to get vaccinated regardless of risk profiles. But that same component of risk profiles, like there are certain diseases that you get vaccines for that have different consequences, potential consequences for men than women. Right, like mumps can make men sterile. They don't have the same consequences for women, right? So I remember being fortunate enough to talk to Peter McCullough about that. Again, having a young child made me think about that. And he said, like, he always kind of just went by the book when it came to vaccines. He didn't think much of it, but he came to realize that no, like every health profile is unique, right? All of us have unique risks, and so we should be taking an individualized approach to vaccines and to all medical care. And so once again, methodological individualism for the win, just as applicable, and perhaps even more applicable when it comes to the direct ramifications of medical prescription as it does to the value it comes with economic theory, and that has been completely drained out of the system, in part because the financial incentives do not want you to think about patients individually because it makes it more difficult to bill, which again, I think goes into the demand for direct primary care and other health alternatives out there, which again, another silver lining is greater interest in this sort of heterodox view of medicine. Not that they're prescribing snake oil instead of big pharmaceutical drugs, but just their entire perception. It all comes down to the financing of it, and I think that is another aspect to it that, again, the codification of medical care writ large, I think, helped play the role to this authoritarian dynamic that we saw play out with COVID.
Well, and I think maybe our fourth and final lesson that we'll talk about is the reaction among alleged libertarians to the whole thing. And you saw phrases that came out, which was, there are no libertarians in a pandemic, right? This was an opportunity by people who hate freedom and free markets to just say, "Hey, those sorts of things, they're freedoms are not absolute. Human rights are not absolute. Look at this threat that's going on, and we have to hand everything over to the state to plan." And just to give you some basic history about here at the Mises Institute was, of course, people when things like this happen, people are interested in, okay, what's the editorial line coming out of a place like the Mises Institute? There are, of course, many other similar organizations that people look to as well. And this goes to the whole issue of, right, the shock and awe campaign from from the regime on this, in that as soon as it happened, obviously guys like you and me and Jeff Deist, who was president here at the time, were like, locking people in their homes without so much as a legislative debate clearly does not fit with our image and with our positions on things. So we immediately started looking at, okay, how are we going to phrase our opposition to these things? But so much information came in so fast, so many changes just were so overwhelming that it took us a few weeks even to figure out, because and part of it too was no one on staff, but we even had like wealthy donors and people like that who were saying, "Oh, well, I mean, obviously we can't oppose the lockdowns; they're necessary, or else everyone will die in this new plague." And then we were the first organization of our type to just come out and say, "End the lockdowns." And we got so much hate mail from other libertarian organizations, quote unquote, and also from some of our own supporters saying this is insane. And that was just the world we were in.
And one of the great things that I take tremendous pride in, working for the Institute, being affiliated with the Institute, was the fact that we still had Mises U in 2020. And we had some provisions that kind of prevent us from, we officially closed our doors so to get away with certain Alabama laws. They literally changed the laws in Alabama mid Mises U, so we had to take some adjustments into the way that we conducted our normal business to get away with it. But not only did we speak out against lockdowns, but we were holding events during lockdowns, which again goes to the praxis element of it. And two, my big takeaway on this issue is twofold. One, this is why the great Lew Rockwell has talked about regime libertarians. And you can see this, I think, in a variety of ways. One was, people who are soft on the war issue when there's enough propaganda apparatus built around the need to go invade a country in the defense of freedom. Two is, again, just recognizing that these government actors are not simply grounded in a bad economic worldview, or there's some honest misunderstandings in terms of honest philosophical differences, but expecting, having as your common assumption that people in D.C. are actively lying to you and acting in bad faith. And I think you have a lot of people that are trying to rationalize, oh, well, we may not necessarily support X, Y, and Z, but A, B, and C, their policy goals are generally good, and therefore, how do we privatize Fauciism, essentially, right? We saw this play out big time in Florida, right, where you had libertarians basically trying to argue on property rights grounds, which I'm sympathetic to, right? Like, oh, well, you shouldn't have restrictions on businesses being able to discriminate for vaccine employees and the like, failing to recognize that, one, we live in a civil rights society, not a property rights society. So that notion of private discrimination only works for people who question the narrative of the regime, right? You can't discriminate against anyone else besides people outside of the allowable opinion there. So that should probably raise a red flag. But to the extent to which these private actors were simply responding to government edicts and government propaganda and the like. And so there is a room there, I think, for creating that tension to protect liberty, because if you didn't have that in Florida, then vaccine passports could have very well gone mainstream there. So that's an element to it, is recognizing and having an inherent distrust of D.C. in general, that these are simply not well-intentioned people with different views on economics, but typically bad actors. And the second aspect of it is kind of I think the idea of thin libertarianism went out the window, because it turns out that when you have additional skin in the game, right? If you are an elderly libertarian professor, for example, and you are genuinely concerned, understandably so, right? You're in that age bracket where COVID is a much bigger deal than your 20-year-old student. It is understandable to be more fearful. And therefore, it is understandable why you would try to rationalize a protective sort of environment to mitigate those fears, right? I mean, similar to, we have, if you have an Eastern European libertarian, right, their concerns about Russia are going to be different than an American perspective of it. So we might have different disagreements on foreign policy there because they've got additional skin in the game. And so the idea that you can have this sort of value-free, like thin libertarian, like you're only motivated by kind of a purely, I don't think held up in practice there, given some of the people out there advocating and defending, a privatized version of, government policy there. There is something that is deeper there that can cloud things, and I think that was getting full on display in that dynamic. And again, it turns out, a lot of libertarians, we see this particularly on cultural issues, they have no problem kind of going with the flow, the general flow. They'll just critique, the taxing element of it. They'll make critiques in the margins. But if you generally agree with the general direction, the general aims, then it's no surprise what you'll end up being apologists for.
Well, and and you remember, you just kind of touched on this right then, right? Is the cry that, hey, it's a private organization, it can do what they want. And it always seems the people who said that were in favor of restricting liberty. They were in favor of helping the regime, right? So these private organizations are doing what the regime wants them to do, and hey, they're private. We should support them. And of course, sure, they're a private organization. They can discriminate openly, in our view, right? As you say, in a true private property view, people can discriminate against whoever they want, whenever they want. And you know what else? I can also denounce those people and criticize them and say that your business is trash and you're a despicable person for refusing to let unvaccinated people in your store. I can say that all day. There's nothing about libertarianism that says I have to keep my mouth shut and not criticize private sector owners. That's ridiculous.
Well, I just noted that I recognized at the time the amount of people, the amount of libertarians that were willing to criticize the idea of restricting discrimination against the unvaccinated, and the libertarians willing to criticize the Civil Rights Act. There was not a lot of overlap in those two camps. And that's when I start questioning really your diehard sincerity on the question of property rights. If you're willing out there saying, yes, we should repeal the Civil Rights Act of 1964, I'm more willing to take you seriously. And there's a handful of people that would go that approach. But I remember going back and forth with Justin Amash, and he would not answer the Civil Rights Act question. And I was like, okay, I'm a little less interested in your opinion on this topic.
Well, they've all fallen into the Gary Johnson bake the cake trap, right? Where that's essentially what that sort of left-wing version of libertarianism is. Hey, look, if a gay couple comes to you and says bake a cake that says happy gay marriage, then you should be required under force of law to do so.
I did pray, Gary North's, or Gary Johnson's, Gary North would have had a different opinion, but Gary Johnson's view, you have to bake the cake, but you don't have to frost it, is always one of my favorite opinions on coerced speech, right?
That's like something Bill Clinton would say. I mean, what a ridiculous waste of time if that's what libertarians are doing. And so I think we just learned that really, yeah, at least among people who live in the Beltway or are interested in working for some of these Washington affiliated organizations, there really are no libertarians when it comes to a pandemic because they just really can't get away from the narrative. And yeah, that whole idea is, well, we'll privatize the lockdowns somehow. We'll privatize the mandatory testing. I literally got articles as editor to that effect and articles talking about how the private sector can handle pandemics. Look at all the wonderful things Bill Gates is doing. Bill Gates, the private sector hero. And fortunately, I had already at the time caught on as to what a villain Bill Gates was. So I was rejecting articles that were saying that. In fact, I went back and checked the website recently just to make sure we didn't have any pro Bill Gates articles because, yeah, the guy is the perfect example of sort of the quasi-private sector, public-private partner sort of thing who was egging on the lockdowns. And so the fact that libertarians were telling me that Bill Gates is the example of the proper private response to this just showed how poorly the thinking was going on that. And yeah, I think we learned some hard lessons during that. The pushback our own supporters gave us in terms of going against the lockdowns, and then later on, of course, so much of the libertarians going along with the talk about conspiracy theories and the lab leak stuff. Lou Rockwell was actually one of the first people to really push the lab leak stuff, which all turned out to be likely true. And so that's where we were in those days. But man, it was just astounding the opposition we encountered in that. So I think those were some important lessons that we learned during that period, and hopefully they will not be soon forgotten because here we are only 5 years out, and very few people are really talking about it anymore. And I I just really hope I don't find us 5 years from now just having forgotten about COVID, and when some sort of similar plan comes along from the government.
I do think the cultural scar, like there's a lot I think the population would be a lot less in the short term. We'll see. Long term, people have short memories there. But I mean, you see it now every time that there's like a new, they're trying to gin up some sort of new public health potential crisis down the road, bird flu or monkeypox or whatever. Like it's met with immediate condescension from a large percentage. I'm not gonna say the majority, but a large percentage there because we've seen this game before. The real tragedy, though, and I think ultimately the necessary component is that this is not something that can simply be changed by pure personnel rotation, right? You have a new NIH director or whatever. It can't be changed by some sort of legislative fiat, right? Ultimately, in libertarianism as a theory of justice, right? Like the best way of making sure stuff like this doesn't happen again is criminal charges in the prosecution of people involved. And I think it was very interesting, right, that Fauci got a pardon, right? The recognition essentially that he needed one. And that dynamic, I'm interested to see, is there anyone that ever actually pays a true personal task? We could talk about institution failure and things like that, but are there individuals who have fingerprints on the policy that they themselves face a price to it? Because I think short of that, I think that happens. That's something that matters. Short of that, then it might take a different form in the future. But I think a lot of these lessons will, given enough time, and should the institutions be able to be successful enough at reestablishing their own credibility, which has happened from time. I mean, the credibility of the FBI was very low in the 90s, and then raised again after 9/11. Right? There's something. We've seen this happen historically. The ability to rebuild credibility within DC institutions there. But again, hopefully, trials for COVID is something that I think is desperately needed to make sure this doesn't happen again.
Yes, I am fully in agreement with you on that. So, yes, we will wait and see. And there maybe, I'm hopeful. I'm not as much a downer as my reputation sometimes indicates. Yeah, I think there's actually some hope that there should be some prosecutions, even if it's just politically motivated. So what? Who cares? Let these people be punished. I mean, that's kind of the system was designed that way. A new party comes in and they pursue political blowback, and that's how some bad actors get punished. That's fine. I can live with that. Well, with that, let's go ahead and wrap up this episode of Radio Rothbard. Thank you, Tho Bishop, for joining me today and taking that pleasant walk down memory lane about former evils of the COVID lockdowns.
I do want to mention that one of the great heroes during COVID was Dr. Robert Malone, who broke the internet when he appeared on Joe Rogan's show, questioning a lot of sort of stuff. And he will be, he's become a big Rothbardian these days. COVID will do that to you. And he'll be speaking at our event in Phoenix on April 26th with the topic, Our Enemy, the Bureaucracy. I'm joined by Tom Woods, who also has written a great book on, well, I guess it's really a bad book, but a good book about the horrors of COVID, and of course, the great Tom DeLorenzo. So if you're interested in this topic in particular in the Arizona area, it is definitely making the trip, worth making the trip to Phoenix on April 26th, and you can find that at Mises.org/events.
Yes, we hope you can join us for that. Well, and thank you all out there listening. Thank you, Tho. We'll be back next week with more on Radio Rothbard. We'll see you next time. One last thing, Radio Rothbard fans. Before you go, I want to make sure you know about our April 26th event in Phoenix, Arizona. And this one's called Our Enemy, the Bureaucracy. This one features Dr. Robert Malone, Tom Woods, and Tom DeLorenzo as they discuss the psychological operations and bureaucratic control, the madness of COVID-era public health, and the corruption and hypocrisy of our federal bureaucracy. Tickets are $100 for Mises members and $120 for non-members. You can register now at Mises.org/Phoenix25, and you have a chance to win a free ticket to the event if you enter the raffle at Mises.org/PhoenixRaffle25 by April 1st.